Part 2. Chapter 4. The Farewell. A tearful promise to the homeland. The brief, bittersweet reprieve that had settled upon Krasnoe after the first conscription drawing proved to be but a fleeting breath before the inevitable plunge into the cold waters of destiny. The 4 young men, Frol, Grigory, Ilya, and Pyotr, had departed, their silhouettes shrinking against the vast, indifferent steppe, leaving behind a profound emptiness in the village and a raw, open wound in the hearts of their families. Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov, though spared that initial, agonizing lottery, found his soul no longer innocent, no longer entirely detached from the grand, brutal currents of the world. He understood now, with a chilling clarity, that the shadow of empire was not a fleeting cloud but a persistent, ever-present specter, capable of reaching into the most secluded corners of life, into the very heart of the peasant. He had grappled with the concept of duty, sought solace in his father's stoicism and Anna's unwavering faith, and had, in his own quiet way, prepared himself for a reckoning that he instinctively knew was merely delayed, not averted. The reckoning arrived with the stark, brutal finality of an autumn wind stripping the last leaves from the birches. It was a cold, gray morning, less than 2 months after the first departure, when a lone, grim-faced Cossack courier, his horse lathered with foam and dust, rode into Krasnoe. He bore not a general ukaz, but a sealed individual summons, addressed directly to Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov. The news spread through the village not as a whisper, but as a collective, heartbroken gasp. This time, the Tsar's long arm had reached precisely for him. Dmitri was in the stable, mucking out the stalls, the comforting scent of hay and warm horseflesh filling the air, when his neighbor, old Matvey, burst in, his face ashen, his breath ragged. "Dima, Dmitri Ivanovich, the courier, he brought a paper. For you, a summons." The words, though simple, struck Dmitri with the force of a physical blow. The shovel clattered from his hand, and a wave of cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over him, turning his limbs to lead. His heart, which had just moments before beaten with its usual steady rhythm of contented labor, now hammered against his ribs with a frantic, suffocating beat. He walked out of the stable, his steps heavy, feeling the eyes of the gathered villagers on him, their faces a mixture of pity and shared sorrow. The Cossack stood by his izba, a stern, unyielding figure in his dark uniform, holding the rolled document. Anna stood beside him, her face drained of all color, her hands clasped tightly over her mouth, her eyes, wide with unshed tears, fixed on Dmitri with a look of profound, helpless anguish. Ivan Petrovich, his back rigid, his ancient eyes filled with a grim, familiar sorrow, stood a little apart, a silent, enduring witness to the cyclical burden of their lives. Dmitri took the parchment from the Cossack. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he unrolled it. The words, clear and precise, blurred before his eyes. By order of His Imperial Majesty, the Tsar, Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov, to report for military service, within 3 days. 3 days. It was an impossible, brutal brevity. 3 days to sever a lifetime's roots. To say goodbye to all that he held dear. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The familiar outlines of his izba, the sturdy stable, the well, the very ground beneath his feet, suddenly felt alien, unreal. This was not a general threat, a distant possibility. This was his fate, specific, inescapable, tearing him from the very fabric of his existence. He looked at Anna, at her beloved face contorted in silent grief, and a raw, visceral pain tore through his chest. He looked at his children, Fyodor and Maria, who, sensing the immense gravity of the moment, clung to their mother's skirts, their small faces filled with confusion and burgeoning fear. He thought of his fields, golden with the promise of the coming harvest, and felt a profound, aching sorrow for the future that would now be so cruelly disrupted. That evening, the Volkov izba, usually filled with the comforting sounds of domesticity, was cloaked in a heavy, oppressive silence. Anna moved like a ghost, preparing a meager meal, her hands working mechanically. Fyodor and Maria, sensing the immense sorrow that had descended upon their home, sat quietly by the hearth, their usual playful spirits extinguished, their young eyes fixed on their father with a troubled curiosity. Ivan Petrovich sat by the window, gazing out at the darkening sky, his face a mask of profound, weary resignation. Dmitri sat at the rough-hewn table, the summons lying before him like a death warrant. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the imperial seal. The cold, impersonal words. How could a piece of paper, written by unseen hands in a distant city, hold such power over his life, over the very heart of his family? His mind reeled, grappling with the sudden, brutal shift from hopeful reprieve to inescapable destiny. He had prepared himself for the possibility of conscription, had wrestled with the abstract concept of duty. But the reality was a blow far more potent than any intellectual contemplation. Anna approached him, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. She knelt beside his chair, taking his calloused hands in hers. "Dima," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "My heart, it breaks. But we will be strong. For you, for the children." Her unwavering faith, her quiet strength, was a lifeline in his sudden despair. Dmitri pulled her into his embrace, holding her fiercely, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her familiar, comforting scent. "Anna," he murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears. "My dearest Anna, how can I leave you? Who will tend the land? Who will keep you safe through the winter?" The questions poured from him, not in defiance, but in raw, aching despair. "God will provide, Dima," she whispered, her voice surprisingly steady, though tears streamed down her face. "And your father, and the village, we are strong, we are Volkovs, we will manage. Only you must promise me. Promise me you will return. That you will come back to us. To Krasnoe. That you will remember our faces. Our home. Our love." Dmitri pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes, seeing the profound depth of her love and her desperate hope. "I promise, Anna," he said, his voice husky. "I promise you, by all that is holy. I will return. To you. To our children. To our land. My heart will always be here. In Krasnoe. I will carry your faces in my soul. I will fight to return to you." His promise was not merely a comfort for her, but a vow to himself. A lifeline in the face of an uncertain future. A reason to endure. He would go, yes, but he would go with a single, burning purpose: to come back. He then went to his children, who had approached cautiously, their small faces etched with worry. Fyodor, his serious eyes wide, looked up at him. "Papa, where are you going?" Dmitri knelt, bringing himself to their level, his eyes blurring. "I must go, my son," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "To serve the Tsar, for Mother Russia. It is a man's duty. But I will return. You must be strong for Mama. You must look after her and Maria. You are the man of the house now." Fyodor, he stroked Fyodor's hair, then Maria's, holding them close, imprinting their small bodies, their innocent scents, on his memory, knowing that each touch might be his last for a very long time. Maria, sensing the finality, began to whimper, burying her face in his neck. Ivan Petrovich approached, his presence a tower of weathered strength. "Come, Dima," he said, his voice rough but kind. "You must prepare, and we will have one last kvass together. A farewell." His father's stoicism, born of a similar past ordeal, was now a source of immense, quiet strength for Dmitri. The next 2 days were a blur of frenzied activity and profound sorrow. Anna worked tirelessly, preparing a small bundle for him, a change of clothes, a piece of cured meat, a small icon of Saint Nicholas, their patron saint, wrapped carefully in a clean cloth. Her movements were swift, efficient, but her face remained pale, and silent tears often tracked paths down her cheeks. The women of the village came, offering meager gifts, whispered blessings, words of comfort for Anna, and grim acknowledgments for Dmitri. There was no joy, no celebration of duty, only a deep, communal lament for another life torn away. Dmitri spent what precious time remained with his father, talking not of war, but of the land. Ivan Petrovich gave him meticulous instructions for the care of the horses, for the timing of the next planting, for the rotation of crops. It was a transfer of sacred knowledge, a silent acknowledgement of the void Dmitri would leave, a poignant reminder of his primary duty. He also spoke to Dmitri of patience, of endurance, of the necessity of relying on God when all earthly comforts were stripped away. "Remember, Dima," he rumbled, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. "The spirit of Russia lives in her peasants, and in her faith. Hold fast to that. and you will endure all things. The last evening arrived with a chilling swiftness. The small izba, usually warm and comforting, now felt cold, immense, filled with an unbearable sense of impending emptiness. They shared a final meal, the food tasting like ash in Dmitri's mouth. Fyodor, understanding more than his father wished, had a solemn look in his eyes. Maria, clinging to Anna, occasionally glanced at Dmitri with wide, tearful eyes, as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, painting the clouds in a faint, mournful gray. Dmitri prepared to leave. He dressed in his rough homespun clothes, the small bundle over his shoulder. He knelt before the icon, his prayer a silent, desperate plea for strength, for protection, for the preservation of his family. He then embraced Anna, a long, agonizing embrace, feeling the warmth of her body against his, memorizing her scent, the feel of her hair. "Remember my promise," he whispered, his voice raw. "I will return. Wait for me, my heart." Anna, her face bathed in tears, could only nod, clutching at his tunic, her strength momentarily failing. "Go with God, my love, go with God." He knelt before Fyodor and Maria, pulling them into a tight embrace, feeling their small arms around his neck, their innocent warmth. "Be good, my children," he murmured, his voice choked. "Listen to your mama and your dedushka. I will be back, I promise. Be strong." He kissed their tear-stained cheeks. A desperate, final farewell. Finally, he turned to Ivan Petrovich. The old man, his eyes a pool of profound sorrow, simply nodded, then pulled Dmitri into a tight, brief embrace. It was a rare display of affection from his stern father. A powerful, unspoken farewell. "Be strong, son," Ivan Petrovich rumbled, his voice thick. "Live with honor, and return to us. The land waits for you." Dmitri walked out of the izba. The cool morning air a sharp shock to his senses. The entire village was gathered on the green. A silent, somber crowd. The Cossack courier, grim and impatient, waited by his horse. Frol, Grigory, Ilya, and Pyotr, the 4 conscripts from the previous drawing, were also there, standing silently, their faces reflecting the arduous journey that lay ahead. They were no longer just names, they were companions in fate. Bound together by the Tsar's decree, Dmitri joined them, his small bundle over his shoulder. He looked back one last time at his izba, at Anna, clutching Fyodor and Maria, her face a mask of profound grief, at his father, standing stoically beside them. He imprinted the image in his mind, a sacred tableau to carry with him into the unknown. This was what he was leaving. This was what he would fight to return to. The Cossack barked an order, and the 5 men began to walk, slowly, solemnly, down the dusty road that led out of Krasnoe. Their footsteps were heavy, echoing the collective sorrow of the village. There were no cheers, no patriotic songs, only the muffled sobs of the women and the profound silence of the men left behind. The sky above them was a uniform gray, as if the heavens themselves mourned their departure. As they walked, Dmitri felt the physical pull of the land, of the village receding behind him. He looked at the familiar fields, the golden rye swaying in the breeze, and knew that its future, its bounty, would now be shaped by hands other than his own. The church dome, its onion shape a beacon of faith, slowly diminished into the distance. The vast steppe stretched before them, boundless and indifferent, a daunting path to an uncertain future. He walked beside his fellow conscripts, sharing their silence, their unspoken fears. They were all peasants, men of the land, now transformed into reluctant soldiers, instruments of a distant empire's will. They were all leaving behind families, homes, lives built on the rhythms of nature, now abruptly severed by the decree of man. He thought of Anna's tears, of Fyodor's bewildered gaze, of Maria's small, trusting hand. He thought of his father's enduring strength, his quiet words of duty and honor. Dmitri's heart ached with a profound, almost unbearable sorrow, but beneath the pain, a new resolve began to harden within him. He was a peasant, yes, a man of peace, but he was also a Volkov, a son of Ivan Petrovich, a man of steadfast faith. He would not break, he would endure, he would carry the image of his family, the warmth of his home, the smell of his land. Within him, a sacred trust. He would remember his promise to Anna, a vow that would light his way through the darkness that lay ahead. He would cling to his faith, tested now by the harsh reality of separation, but ultimately deepened by it. The echoes of a distant war had arrived in Krasnoe, shattering its tranquility and claiming him. But they would not shatter the steadfastness of Dmitri's heart. His path now lay before him, stretching into the unknown, a journey of profound duty, of enduring love, and of an unyielding spirit in the face of the vast, unforgiving world. He walked, the dust rising from his boots, the familiar landscape fading behind him, a small figure swallowed by the immensity of Russia, carrying the weight of his legacy, his duty, and his unbreakable promise to return. The communal sorrow of Krasnoe slowly receded, replaced by the relentless, monotonous rhythm of marching, a soldier's gait, towards a destiny unforeseen. Chapter 5. The Barracks and the Brotherhood of Fear. The dusty road, which for generations had merely connected Krasnoe to the district town of Bolshe-Lippy, now stretched before Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov as a desolate, endless ribbon, unwinding him from all that was familiar, all that was sacred. With each step away from his beloved village, the ache in his heart deepened, a profound, physical pain that mirrored the growing chasm between his past and his terrifyingly uncertain future. The figures of Anna, his father, and his children, standing silently on the village green, had long since receded into the vastness of the steppe, becoming mere specks against the immensity of the horizon, then vanishing entirely. Yet, their images remained burned into his soul, a vibrant, aching tableau he carried with him as a talisman against the encroaching emptiness. He walked beside Frol, Grigory, Ilya, and Pyotr, and 6 other peasant men from neighboring hamlets. All conscripts now, bound by the Tsar's decree. The Cossack courier, grim and unyielding, rode alongside them, his presence a constant reminder of their captivity, of the new, rigid order that now governed their lives. The initial days of their journey were a grim procession, a continuous, monotonous march under a sky that seemed to grow heavier with each passing verst. The initial anguish of farewell, though still a raw wound in his soul, had begun to recede, replaced by a dull ache of weariness and a gnawing uncertainty about the unknown that lay ahead. He had walked in silence, his small bundle heavy on his shoulder, the worn wooden cross from his father clutched in his pocket, his gaze fixed on the broad, unyielding backs of his fellow conscripts. They were a motley collection of peasants, men forged by the land and the simple, enduring rhythms of village life, now abruptly thrust into the grand, impersonal machinery of empire. The barracks, when they finally appeared through the autumn mist, were not the grand, imposing structures Dmitri had vaguely imagined from the whispers of returning soldiers. They loomed before them like a grim, foreboding fortress on the horizon, a cluster of long, low, unpainted wooden buildings, stark and utilitarian, surrounded by a high, splintered wooden fence. The air here was thick with a cacophony of unfamiliar sounds, the shouted commands of sergeants, the rhythmic tramp of marching boots, the clang of metal, the distant, unsettling reports of rifle fire, and a pervasive, acrid smell of stale sweat, cheap tobacco, and unwashed bodies that seemed to cling to the very air. This was the threshold of his new world, a stark and brutal antithesis to the gentle, wholesome fragrance of his native Krasnoe. His introduction to military life was abrupt and devoid of ceremony. They were herded like cattle into a vast, cavernous hall, their names barked by a grizzled, hawk-nosed sergeant whose voice was a rasping roar. Dmitri, accustomed to the quiet deference of village life, felt a cold shock at the immediate, brutal discipline. There was no greeting, no comfort, only commands. Their peasant clothes were stripped from them, replaced by coarse, ill-fitting uniforms of gray wool. Scratchy against his skin, his carefully packed bundle, containing Anna's bread and the icon of St. Nicholas, was roughly inspected, his small wooden cross briefly scrutinized by a stony-faced corporal, then returned without comment. His identity as Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov, man of the land, husband, father, son of Krasnoe, seemed to be stripped away with his old clothes, replaced by the impersonal designation of recruit. The barracks itself was a stark, cavernous room, filled with rows of narrow wooden cots, barely separated by enough space for a man to stand. The air was heavy, humid, thick with the exhalations of dozens of bodies, the oppressive scent of damp wood and human effluvium. It was a space utterly devoid of the warmth and personal touches of any human dwelling he had ever known. Here, there was no hearth, no icon in the corner, no familiar aroma of baking bread, only the cold, impersonal order of the Tsar. His first days melted into a blur of relentless, monotonous routine, a dizzying assault on his senses and his spirit. The brutal discipline of military life was absolute, unwavering. The day began before dawn, with a piercing bugle call that tore through the fragile darkness, instantly shattering any lingering remnants of sleep. They were forced from their cots, their bodies aching from the unfamiliar hardness of the planks, and into the cold, damp morning air for endless drills. Left, right, the sergeants bellowed, their voices raw with perpetual command, their faces contorted in perpetual fury. Dmitri, whose movements had always been guided by the natural rhythm of the land, by the intuitive flow of planting and harvesting, now found himself attempting to conform to the rigid, unnatural cadence of the march, his muscles protesting, his mind struggling to comprehend the arbitrary nature of the commands. The stark realities of war preparation permeated every waking moment. They were drilled in the art of killing, taught to hold and fire the heavy, clumsy rifles, their shoulders aching from the recoil, their ears ringing with the deafening reports. They practiced bayonet charges against straw dummies, plunging the cold steel into inanimate forms, urged on by the sergeant's guttural shouts. Dmitri, a man who had only ever used tools to coax life from the earth, now found himself wielding instruments designed solely for destruction. His hands, accustomed to the soft soil, now gripped cold metal, their familiarity with life replaced by an unsettling intimacy with death. The training was designed not merely to teach skills, but to break the individual will, to forge a collective, obedient machine, stripping away the nuances of personal thought and feeling. His comrades were a diverse assembly, drawn from every corner of Mother Russia, a collection of men he would never have encountered in the quiet confines of Krasnoe. There was Ivan Stepanovich, a burly, red-faced man from a northern forest village, whose boisterous humor seemed to mask a deep, underlying fear. There was slender Alexei, a timid boy from a distant steppe settlement, whose eyes were constantly wide with terror, his body trembling at every shouted command. There were hardened veterans, older conscripts who had already seen service, their faces etched with a grim, weary knowledge, their silence a profound testament to unseen horrors. And there were his fellow villagers, Frol, whose usual cheerfulness had vanished, replaced by quiet, shell-shocked bewilderment, Grigory, whose face remained a mask of profound sorrow, his eyes often distant, lost in thought of his young wife and infant, Ilya, who moved with the somber quietude of a man already acquainted with grief, and Pyotr, whose stoicism seemed to deepen with each passing day, becoming almost a shield against the harshness of their new reality. A strange, unspoken brotherhood began to form amongst them, a silent pact forged in the crucible of shared fear and common suffering. They were all peasants, stripped of their individuality, bound by the impersonal demands of the Tsar, facing an uncertain, terrifying future. In the brief, stolen moments between drills, in the dim light of the barracks at night, they would exchange hushed words, share meager rations, or simply sit in silence, their shared dread a tangible, unspoken bond. They spoke of home, of their families, of the land they had left behind, their voices low, filled with a profound yearning that pierced the oppressive atmosphere of the barracks. Dmitri's initial struggle to reconcile his deep-seated faith with the stark, brutal harshness around him was immense, almost overwhelming. In Krasnoe, God's presence had been woven into the very fabric of existence, in the turning of the seasons, in the miracle of germination, in the abundance of the harvest, in the comforting routines of family life, in the quiet sanctity of the church. Here, in the barracks, God seemed distant, almost absent. The relentless discipline, the crude language of the sergeants, the constant violence of the drills, the sheer dehumanization of their existence, how could these reconcile with the benevolent, guiding hand of providence he had always known? He knelt each night by his narrow cot, clutching the worn wooden cross from his father, his lips moving in silent prayer, but the words felt hollow, echoing in the vast, impersonal space of the barracks. He prayed for Anna, for Fyodor, for Maria, for their safety and well-being. He prayed for strength, for endurance, for protection, but he also prayed for understanding, for a glimpse of God's purpose in this brutal, chaotic world. Where was God in the shouted commands? In the cold gleam of the bayonet? In the dehumanizing uniformity of their existence? His simple, unwavering faith, once a comforting certainty, was now assaulted by doubts, by questions he dared not voice aloud. The vulgarity of the barracks life was another assault on his spirit. The language of the soldiers was coarse, filled with obscenities and crude jokes. Dmitri, accustomed to the respectful, measured language of his village, found himself shrinking from the constant barrage of crude humor and casual blasphemy. It felt like a desecration of his inner sanctuary, a contamination of the spiritual purity he had always sought to maintain. He tried to ignore it, to withdraw into the quiet confines of his own mind, but the harshness permeated the very air he breathed. He observed his comrades. Their coping mechanisms varied and often desperate. Some embraced the coarseness, seeking a fleeting sense of power in their own vulgarity. Others drank the meager vodka rations, seeking oblivion. Still others retreated into a profound, almost catatonic silence. Dmitri, however, clung to his inner world, to the memories of Krasnoe, to the warmth of his family's love. These memories became his shield, his sanctuary against the relentless assault on his spirit. He would close his eyes during the monotonous drills, and for a fleeting moment, he would be back in his fields, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, the cool earth beneath his bare feet. The sergeants, grizzled and merciless, seemed to delight in breaking the peasant spirit, in stripping away their individuality, their ties to home. They taught them to kill, yes, but also to forget the scent of rye, the warmth of a woman's hand, the sound of a child's laughter, to forget everything that made them men, and become mere cogs in the Tsar's great military machine. But Dmitri, despite the pain, despite the fear, refused to forget. He clung to his memories, to his promise, to his faith, as a drowning man clings to a spar in a tempestuous sea. His physical body, though strong from a lifetime of labor, rebelled against the unnatural demands placed upon it. His muscles ached constantly, his feet were perpetually blistered, his shoulders bruised from the rifle butt. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and disturbed by nightmares of shouting, of endless marching, of the cold, impersonal faces of officers. Yet, beneath the physical torment, a subtle hardening began to take place, a grim resilience. His body, like his spirit, was being forged in a new, harsher crucible. One evening, as the barracks lay in a restless semi-darkness, the air thick with the muffled coughs and sighs of sleeping men, Dmitri whispered a prayer, a desperate plea for guidance. He still clutched the wooden cross, its smooth surface a tangible comfort against the cold reality of his new existence. He thought of Father Sergei's words about suffering as a path to purification, about the inscrutable wisdom of God's plan. Was this his purification? Was this the path to a deeper understanding? He sought a sign, a glimmer of divine presence in this desolate landscape. He saw Ilya, the young widower from Krasnoe, lying on his cot, his face turned to the wall, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Ilya, who had already lost his wife, now forced to abandon his infant son, his life a profound testament to arbitrary cruelty. Dmitri felt a surge of profound empathy for him, for the shared injustice of their fate. He thought of the other conscripts from Krasnoe, their quiet despair, their own shattered idols. They were all bound together, not by choice, but by the relentless decree of empire, by the shared trauma of separation. This shared suffering, this common bond of fear and loneliness, slowly began to forge a new kind of connection between them. In the depths of the barracks, stripped of their former lives, they found a strange solidarity, a shared glance, a mumbled word of encouragement, a small act of kindness. These became precious gestures, tiny sparks of humanity in the vast, impersonal darkness. They were a brotherhood of fear, yes, but also a brotherhood of shared loss, a desperate clinging to one another in the face of an indifferent world. Dmitri's simple faith, once a serene river flowing through a peaceful valley, was now a turbulent torrent, crashing against jagged rocks. He questioned not God's existence, but his apparent absence, his silence in the face of such suffering. He struggled to reconcile the gentle teachings of the gospel with the brutal realities of military life. Yet, even in his doubt, he found himself clinging to the core tenets: love, compassion, forgiveness. He found himself seeking out opportunities for small acts of kindness amidst the harshness. Offering a steadying hand to a trembling recruit. Sharing a morsel of his meager rations. These were the only ways he could keep his faith alive, not as a blind obedience to dogma, but as a living, breathing principle of human connection in a dehumanizing environment. The days blurred into weeks, marked only by the increasing rigor of their training, the growing ache in his bones, and the deepening lines of weariness on his face. The smells of gunpowder and sweat became more familiar, the shouted commands less jarring. He learned to march with the relentless precision of a soldier, to handle his rifle with a grim efficiency. His body, once attuned to the gentle rhythms of the earth, slowly began to adapt to the brutal, unnatural rhythm of war, but his heart, his very essence, remained tethered to Krasnoe, to Anna, to Fyodor, to Maria, to the promise he had made. The echoes of the distant war were now not merely whispers from afar, they were the very sounds of his new life. The relentless, grinding reality that threatened to shatter his spirit. But in the midst of this crucible, a new kind of steadfastness was slowly, painfully, being forged within him, a resilience born of endurance, fueled by love, and tempered by a deeply questioned, yet ultimately unwavering, faith. He was becoming a soldier. Yes, but he remained, fundamentally, Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov, man of Krasnoe, carrying the gentle soil of his homeland in his soul, and the promise of return burning in his heart. Chapter 6. The Fields of Blood. Witness to man's folly. The weeks of brutal discipline in the barracks at Bolshy Lippy, designed to strip away the peasant and forge the soldier, culminated not in a gradual acclimatization, but in an abrupt, terrifying plunge into the very crucible of conflict. The relentless drills, the shouted commands, the constant weariness, had indeed hardened Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov's body and sharpened his reflexes, transforming him from a man of the earth into a grudging instrument of war. Yet, his spirit, though battered and deeply questioned, remained tethered to the memory of Krasnoe, to the warmth of his izba, and to the sacred promise he had made to Anna. He had learned the movements of a soldier, but the heart of a peasant still beat beneath his coarse uniform. Filled with the simple faith that had guided his life, he yearned for the return of the familiar, the comfort of predictable rhythms. But the relentless machinery of the Tsar's army had pulled him inexorably towards a destiny he could not comprehend. The transition from the simulated violence of the training ground to the stark, terrifying reality of the battlefield occurred with a chilling swiftness. One cold, gray morning, still shrouded in the lingering mists of autumn, their company, along with hundreds of others, was roused before dawn. The air hummed with an unfamiliar tension, a palpable dread that permeated the ranks. There were no explanations, only grim-faced orders to form up, to prepare for a long march. The whispered rumors, vague and unsettling, spoke of a decisive engagement, of a grand strategy, of a push towards the Turkish lines far to the south. Each step they took further alienated Dmitri from the world he knew. The familiar landmarks giving way to an increasingly desolate, war-torn landscape. The march was arduous, stretching for days across vast, unfamiliar landscapes, the monotony broken only by the growing, grim signs of an approaching war zone. The fields, once fertile and promising, became scarred and desolate, churned by countless boots and wagon wheels, littered with the discarded detritus of human passage. The very earth seemed to weep. The air grew thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and the faint, nauseating odor of distant decay, the unmistakable smell of violence and death that clung to the wind like a shroud. Villages they passed were abandoned, their izbas silent and empty, their fields overgrown with weeds, haunting monuments to lives abruptly disrupted. Dmitri felt a profound sense of foreboding, a chill that seeped into his bones deeper than the autumn cold. This was not the orderly world of Krasnoe, where life unfolded according to divine cycles, where suffering had a discernible purpose. This was a landscape desecrated, warped by the destructive folly of men, a testament to chaos. Then came the sounds. First, a distant, muffled rumble, like thunder on a summer's day, but without the promise of life-giving rain. only the threat of unseen destruction. Then, closer, a dull, resonant boom, followed by another, and another, growing steadily in intensity until the very ground beneath their feet began to tremble subtly. A rhythmic vibration that pulsed through his tired body, reaching into his very core. It was the sound of artillery, the voice of war itself, speaking in a language of thunder and overwhelming destruction, a language utterly foreign to the peasant's ear. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped Dmitri. It was the primal, visceral fear of a creature caught in a snare, of a man utterly powerless against forces beyond his comprehension. A nameless, formless dread that constricted his throat. They arrived at the front lines under the deceptive cover of a moonless night. The sounds of battle now a deafening, continuous roar that obliterated all other senses, drowning out even the frantic beat of his own heart. The air was thick with the choking stench of gunpowder smoke, a noxious, suffocating cloud that burned his throat and stung his eyes, reducing visibility to mere feet. The sky, usually a tapestry of indifferent stars, was sporadically illuminated by sudden, blinding flashes of light, distant cannon fire, musket volleys that ripped through the darkness with a terrifying crackle, and earth-shattering explosions that threw men and mud into the sky, momentarily turning night into a ghastly, flickering day. The ground underfoot was churned into a treacherous mire of mud and frozen earth. Treacherous to navigate, littered with discarded equipment, and, chillingly, with the unseen forms of fallen men. Their silence a profound testament to their sudden demise. Dmitri was part of a line ordered to hold a shallow, muddy trench, dug hastily into the scarred earth. He pressed himself against the cold, damp wall, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, louder than the incessant roar of the cannons. His rifle, once a heavy, alien object in his hands during drills, now felt strangely insubstantial, utterly inadequate against the overwhelming chaos that surrounded him. He saw Frol, huddled beside him, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored Dmitri's own. A raw, naked fear. Grigory, the young husband, was whimpering softly, almost imperceptibly, his body trembling uncontrollably, lost in a private world of dread. Ilya, the widower, sat slumped, his face buried in his hands, a silent, profound despair radiating from him, as if life had no more to offer him. Pyotr, usually so stoic, breathed in ragged, desperate gasps, his usual composure shattered. The sun rose, not as the gentle, life-giving light of Krasnoe, bringing warmth and purpose, but as a blood-red eye peering through the thick, acrid smoke that clung to the horizon. A malevolent presence. It illuminated a scene of utter, incomprehensible devastation. The field before them, once perhaps a peaceful pasture, a place of grazing livestock, was now a churned wasteland, pockmarked with craters, littered with the broken limbs of trees, and, most horrifyingly, with the contorted forms of dead men, their uniforms stark against the mud, their faces frozen in expressions of agony or surprise. The sheer scale of the carnage, the senseless waste of human life, the indiscriminate destruction, struck Dmitri with a profound shock that transcended fear, reaching into the deepest core of his being. Then came the charge, a shouted order, raw and desperate, piercing the din, cutting through the chaos with its brutal clarity. Forward, for Tsar and God. Dmitri, propelled by a primal instinct of obedience, of communal movement, pushed himself from the trench. He ran, or rather, stumbled forward, his heavy boots sinking into the viscous mud, his rifle clumsy and useless in his trembling hands. The noise was deafening, a monstrous symphony of human and mechanical rage, the guttural roar of thousands of men, the piercing screams of the wounded, the relentless crackle of muskets, the whistling shriek of cannonballs ripping through the air, followed by earth-shattering explosions that threw men and mud into the sky. Momentarily blinding him, he ran, his breath ragged, his lungs burning with the acrid smoke, his mind a chaotic whirl of terror and disbelief. This was not war as he had imagined it, a grand, heroic struggle depicted in tales and sermons. This was madness, a senseless, overwhelming chaos that swallowed men whole, spitting out broken bodies. He saw men fall around him, suddenly, silently, like scarecrows struck by an unseen hand, their lives extinguished in an instant. He saw a man's head disappear in a red mist. Another fall clutching his gut. His screams swallowed by the roar. His agony a fleeting, horrifying image. The images seared themselves into his mind. Indelible, horrifying, permanently altering the landscape of his soul. His faith, once the bedrock of his very being, the unshakable foundation upon which his entire world was built, began to shatter under this relentless assault. Where was God in this senseless carnage? Where was his benevolent hand in the midst of such widespread suffering? Such unbridled destruction, such profound human folly? He had prayed for guidance, for understanding, for purification through suffering, as Father Sergei had preached in the quiet sanctity of their village church. But this was not purification, this was defilement, a staining of the soul. This was not a test of faith, it was a brutal assault on the very concept of divine order, on the notion of a just and caring God. The gentle teachings of the gospel, of love and forgiveness, seemed impossibly distant, utterly irrelevant, a cruel mockery in this inferno of human brutality. He stumbled over a body, its uniform stark against the mud, its face upturned, eyes staring blankly at the smoke-filled sky. A lifeless shell. It was a man, a peasant like himself, his face young, his uniform stained with blood. Dmitri felt a surge of nausea, a profound revulsion that twisted his gut. This was not an enemy, not the infidel of the priest's sermons. This was a human being, a son, a brother, perhaps a father, just like himself. The abstract concept of the Turk dissolved in the horrifying reality of a human face contorted in death. Man killing man. For what? For whose glory? The Tsar? God? It felt like a profound, unforgivable blasphemy, a sin against the very essence of creation. He found himself firing his rifle, automatically, blindly, the recoil jarring his shoulder, the smell of burnt powder filling his nostrils, burning his throat. He aimed at no one, simply discharged the weapon, a desperate act of self-preservation, a futile gesture against the overwhelming terror. He ran, not advancing, but merely moving, desperately seeking any form of cover, any respite from the ceaseless storm of steel and screams. His legs felt like lead, his lungs burned, yet some primal instinct propelled him forward. He saw Frau fall, clutching his leg, his cheerful face twisted in a silent scream of agony. He saw Grigory, the young husband, stumble, then disappear into the swirling smoke, his fate unknown, swallowed by the chaos. Ilya, the widower, moved with a strange, unnatural calm, almost a detachment, as if life had already inflicted upon him the worst it could offer, rendering him immune to further suffering. Pyotr, the stoic, fought with a grim, mechanical efficiency, his movements precise, almost robotic, a man transformed into a weapon. They were all transformed, broken in different ways by the unbearable reality of the battlefield, their former selves dissolving in the acidic bath of war. A lull in the fighting, sudden and disorienting, descended upon them, a terrifying stillness that replaced the cacophony. The roar of cannons subsided, replaced by the ghastly symphony of groans and cries from the wounded. A sound more terrifying, more visceral, than the battle itself. The air, still thick with smoke, now carried the pungent scent of blood and raw earth, the sickening perfume of death. Dmitri found himself lying in a shallow crater, mud plastered to his face, his body trembling uncontrollably, not from cold, but from a profound, inner shock that convulsed his very being. His mind, usually so clear in its simple logic, was a chaotic mess of fragmented images, a severed limb, a gaping wound, the blank, staring eyes of a dead man. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his palms against his temples, trying to block out the horror. But the images persisted, burned into his memory with searing intensity. He thought of Krasnoe, of the golden field swaying under a benevolent sun, of Anna's gentle touch, of his children's innocent laughter. The contrast was so stark, so utterly incomprehensible. His village, a place of growth and life, of communal harmony, of peace. This place, a field of death and destruction, a monument to human folly, to senseless violence. He tried to pray, to call upon God, to utter the familiar words of solace. But the words felt like ash in his mouth, meaningless, impotent. What was the purpose of this suffering? What divine plan could encompass such brutality? Such widespread agony? His simple, unwavering faith, rooted in the predictable benevolence of nature and the comforting rituals of the Church, had been profoundly shaken, perhaps shattered beyond repair. He had believed in a God who provided, who guided, who cared. But here, in this field of blood, God seemed silent, distant, utterly indifferent, his presence obscured by the smoke of battle. The raw fear, having gripped him with an icy hand, slowly gave way to a deeper, more pervasive sense of dread, a profound weariness of the soul that settled like a crushing weight. He was alive, yes, he had survived, but what remained of the Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov who had left Krasnoe? What fragments of his peace, his innocence, his faith, could possibly survive this crucible of fire? He looked at his hands, stained with mud and what might have been blood, and saw not the hands of a peasant, a nurturer of life, but the hands of a participant in this great, terrible folly, a man who had witnessed and been a part of the senseless slaughter. He lay there for a long time, listening to the moans of the wounded, the distant shouts of sergeants, the chilling sounds of scavenger birds already circling overhead. A grim procession above the fallen. The sun began its descent, casting long, grotesque shadows across the field of corpses, stretching the forms of the dead into macabre caricatures. It was a sunset unlike any he had seen in Krasnoe. Not a promise of restful night, but a lingering testament to the day's unspeakable horrors. A final, brutal judgment. He had witnessed man's folly, and in doing so, the foundations of his beliefs had been profoundly, irrevocably shaken. His steadfast heart, though still beating, now carried the heavy burden of a world turned upside down, a world where God's presence seemed to have receded before the terrifying, destructive power of men. He was no longer merely a peasant soldier, he was a witness, a survivor, carrying the indelible scars of the fields of blood within his very soul. And the echoes of this conflict would surely resonate within him, ceaselessly, for all the days of his life. Chapter 7. The Unanswered Prayer, a Crisis of Faith. The sun rose on the day following Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov's first battle. Yet its light brought no solace, only a stark, unflinching illumination of the horror. The field, a day before a testament to human folly, was now a silent, gruesome tableau of death. The air, still thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder, now carried the sickly sweet odor of blood and something else more profound, the smell of extinguished life, of innocence irrevocably lost. The groans of the wounded, once drowned by the thunder of cannons, now rose with chilling clarity, a symphony of human suffering that pierced the very soul. For Dmitri, who had endured the preceding day with the primal, unthinking instinct of a trapped animal, the true crucible began now, not in the chaos of battle, but in the dreadful stillness of its aftermath, when the mind, unburdened by immediate peril, began to reckon with the unbearable truth. He lay in the shallow crater where he had sought refuge, his body aching not merely from physical exertion but from an exhaustion that seeped into his very bones. An exhaustion of the spirit. His uniform was caked with mud and grime, his hands trembled, and his face was stiff with dried sweat and the dust of the battlefield. But it was his inner landscape that was most profoundly altered. The simple, unshakable faith that had been the bedrock of his existence. The inherited wisdom of generations of peasants rooted in the benevolent cycles of nature and the comforting rituals of the Orthodox Church, now felt like a fragile, shattered idol. He watched the stretcher-bearers move through the field, their figures grim and weary, gathering the dead and the dying. He saw faces he recognized from his own company, from Krasnoe and neighboring villages. Young Frol, whose laughter had once filled the barracks with cheer, lay motionless, his face turned towards the sky, a dark, unnatural stain blooming across his chest. Grigory, the young husband, whose wife had just given birth, was nowhere to be seen amidst the visible dead, his fate an agonizing, unanswered question. The sight of these bodies, so recently full of life, now inert and broken, struck Dmitri with a profound, almost paralyzing despair that transcended mere fear. They were not abstract casualties of war, they were men, like him, with families, with dreams, with lives that had been brutally extinguished in an instant. Where is God? The question, unbidden and raw, formed in Dmitri's mind, a blasphemous whisper that both terrified and compelled him. He had always believed in a benevolent providence, in a divine plan that, however mysterious, was ultimately just. He had understood suffering as a test, a path to purification, as Father Sergiy had so often preached. But what purification could come from this? From the senseless slaughter of innocent men? From the agony of the wounded, left to die in the mud? From the profound, inexplicable evil of man turning upon man with such ferocity? He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to banish the gruesome images that paraded relentlessly before his inner sight. A severed limb lying incongruously on the churned earth. A soldier crying out for his mother with a voice suddenly high and childlike. The blank stare of a dead man's eyes, fixed on the smoke-filled sky. He tried to pray, to recite the familiar words of the liturgy, to call upon the Holy Mother. But the words felt hollow, utterly meaningless. They seemed to dissolve in the pervasive stench of death, in the chilling symphony of suffering. His faith had taught him of a God who cared, who guided, who watched over his children. But here, in this field of blood, God seemed profoundly absent, his presence swallowed by the chaos, his voice deafened by the roar of cannons and the screams of men. Was he indifferent? Was he powerless? Or was the entire concept of a benevolent God merely a comforting illusion? A peasant's dreams shattered by the brutal reality of man's inherent depravity? The thought was terrifying, a chasm opening beneath his feet, threatening to swallow not just his hope, but the very foundation of his moral universe. He remembered his father's stoicism, his words of duty and endurance. But Ivan Petrovich had spoken of his war, a distant, perhaps simpler conflict, where the lines between right and wrong, honor and dishonor, might have been clearer. Here, in this vast, indiscriminate slaughter, such distinctions blurred into a horrifying gray. The enemy was not merely a Turk or an infidel, he was a young man with terrified eyes. A man who cried out for his mother in a tongue Dmitri could not understand. A man who, like himself, was simply trying to survive. The profound moral ambiguities of it all tore at his soul. What difference was there between him, Dmitri, firing a rifle blindly, and the enemy who fired back? Were they not all simply instruments of a grand, destructive folly, puppets dancing to a madman's tune? He saw Ilya, the young widower from Krasnoe, being led away by a corporal, his face utterly devoid of expression, his eyes staring blankly into the distance. Ilya had survived the battle physically unharmed, but his spirit seemed to have been utterly extinguished, replaced by a profound, terrifying emptiness. Dmitri wondered if this would be his own fate, to return to Krasnoe a shell of the man who had left, carrying scars that no physical balm could heal. The thought was chilling, far more terrifying than any wound to the body. He tried to seek comfort in the small wooden cross his father had given him. Clutching it in his trembling hand, its smooth, worn surface, once a tangible link to tradition and divine protection, now felt cold, inert. The prayers he whispered felt like dry leaves scattered by a merciless wind. He yearned for the simple, comforting certainty of his village church, for Father Sergiy's reassuring words, for the familiar aroma of beeswax candles. But that world seemed impossibly distant, a dream from another lifetime. The brutality of their acts, the casual cruelty of some soldiers towards the wounded enemy, the swift, impersonal finality of death in battle, all these assaulted his peasant morality. He had lived by simple, clear principles: honesty, compassion, diligence, reverence for life. Here, those principles seemed not only irrelevant but dangerous, impediments to survival. The army demanded ruthless efficiency, a disregard for suffering, a capacity for violence. He felt himself being twisted, contorted, molded into something he did not recognize. Something profoundly alien to the Dmitri who had knelt before the icon in his izba. He longed for the solitude of his fields, for the vast, open sky of Krasnoe, where he could commune with God in the quiet contemplation of nature. But here, there was no solitude, only the constant presence of hundreds of men, their fears and their depravities pressing in on him. The air was thick with the stench of human despair, a pervasive spiritual darkness that seemed to choke out all light. He thought of Anna's unwavering faith, her steadfast hope in God's benevolence. He remembered her words: "To question is not to lose faith. Dima, it is to seek a deeper understanding." But this was not understanding, this was chaos. This was not a test designed for spiritual growth, It was a grinder that crushed the soul. He felt adrift, lost in a spiritual wilderness where the old maps of his faith seemed useless. Their familiar paths swallowed by a landscape of utter devastation. The sun climbed higher, relentless and indifferent, casting long, grotesque shadows across the field of corpses. The cries of the wounded slowly diminished, replaced by a grim, pervasive silence, broken only by the distant murmur of officers and the mournful cawing of crows. The men of his company, those who had survived, moved with a quiet efficiency. Numb from the shock, their faces ashen and hollow-eyed, they were collecting their dead, tending to their wounded, the grim rituals of war. Dmitri helped, moving through the carnage like a ghost, his hands working mechanically. He lifted bodies, felt the chilling stiffness of limbs that had only hours ago been warm with life. He saw wounds that defied comprehension, flesh torn and mangled by steel and shot. Each sight, each touch, deepened the chasm in his soul. He had seen death in Krasnoe, the peaceful, natural passing of the old, the occasional tragedy of a young life cut short by illness or accident. But this was different. This was violent, senseless, wholesale destruction, perpetrated by man upon man. He looked up at the vast, indifferent sky, his eyes burning with unshed tears. He had always believed in the interconnectedness of all things, in a grand, divine tapestry. But here, the tapestry was torn, shredded, its threads stained with blood. The harmony of creation seemed to have been shattered, replaced by a discordant symphony of suffering and despair. His prayers, once a conduit to God, now felt like desperate cries echoing in a vast, empty void, utterly unanswered. The innocent dying, the brutal acts committed, the profound moral ambiguities, these were the hammers that struck at the foundations of his unwavering faith. He had always believed in the inherent goodness of man, in the capacity for righteousness. But what goodness could exist in this? What righteousness could be found in this field of blood? He saw the depravity of which men were capable, the cold indifference, the brutal efficiency of destruction, and his soul recoiled. He was adrift, unmoored from the anchors of his former life. His connection to the land, his simple faith, his very understanding of God's purpose, all seemed to dissolve in the overwhelming reality of the war. He was a man who had witnessed man's ultimate folly, and in doing so, had lost the comforting certainties of his innocent heart. He was left with questions, with doubts, with a profound sense of spiritual emptiness. The echoes of this conflict, he knew, would not merely linger, they would resonate within him, ceaselessly, testing the very steadfastness of his soul, demanding a new, perhaps more arduous, path towards understanding God in a world irrevocably stained by the blood of innocence. The answers he sought were not to be found in the old ways, but in a new, terrifying journey into the depths of human darkness and the resilience of a shattered, yet perhaps still yearning, soul. Chapter 8. Moments of grace in the abyss. Acts of unexpected humanity. The sun, an indifferent orb in the vast, smoke-laden sky, had climbed higher, casting its unblinking gaze upon the grotesque tableau of the battlefield. The deafening roar of cannon fire had receded, replaced by the ghastly symphony of groans and whimpers, the chilling cries of men whose bodies lay broken upon the churned earth. For Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov, the previous day had been a brutal, soul-shattering assault on every fiber of his being, leaving his once unwavering faith shattered and his heart adrift in a spiritual abyss. He had witnessed man's folly in its most brutal form, the senseless carnage a stark contradiction to the benevolent order he had always known. The profound emptiness left by his unanswered prayers lingered, a cold, heavy weight in his chest. Yet, even in this wasteland of despair, amidst the pervasive stench of death and the crushing weight of human suffering, the human spirit, with its inexplicable capacity for both depravity and profound goodness, began to manifest itself in ways Dmitri had not anticipated. Like tiny, tenacious wildflowers pushing through the cracked earth after a brutal winter, small acts of grace, flashes of unexpected humanity, began to pierce the overwhelming darkness, providing glimmers of a hope he thought irrevocably lost. He lay in the muddy crater, his body trembling, his mind reeling from the horrors he had witnessed. His own rifle lay beside him, its cold metal a stark reminder of the destruction he had participated in. However unwillingly, He tried to reconcile the man he was here with the peasant he had been in Krasnoe. The loving husband and father. The two images clashed, irreconcilable, leaving him adrift. Yet, as the initial shock began to numb, his peasant's instinct for observation, for recognizing the subtle signs of life, began to reassert itself. Even amidst the desolation, he saw a figure moving towards him, a silhouette against the smoke, burdened by something heavy. It was Ivan, the burly, quiet giant from the northern forests, whose strength had been evident even in the barracks. Ivan moved with a deliberate slowness, his face grim, but his eyes, though weary, held a spark of determination. He was carrying a wounded comrade, a young, barely bearded recruit named Semyon, whose leg was a mangled ruin. Ivan's face was smeared with mud and blood, but his grip on Semyon was gentle, careful. He murmured words of reassurance, low and guttural, like a bear comforting its cub, completely oblivious to Dmitri's presence, focused solely on the task of preserving a life. Dmitri watched, transfixed. Here, amidst the pervasive indifference of death, was an act of profound, selfless effort. Ivan was not ordered to do this. He was not driven by discipline or fear of a sergeant's whip. He was moved by something else, something deeper, a spark of pure, unadulterated compassion for a fellow human being. This was not the chaotic, senseless violence he had just witnessed. This was an affirmation of a different kind of human nature. A quiet defiance of the surrounding horror. It was a fleeting, yet powerful, moment of human kindness. Later, as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the gruesome details of the field, the silence of the aftermath was broken only by the mournful cawing of crows and the continued cries of the wounded. Dmitri found himself rising, mechanically, drawn by an unspoken compulsion to join the grim work of recovery. He moved through the churned earth, stepping over the fallen, his senses assaulted by the sights and smells of death. He saw a group of stretcher-bearers, among them his fellow conscript, Pyotr, the stoic man whose face had turned to stone during the battle. Pyotr, usually so reserved, now moved with a quiet efficiency, his broad shoulders bearing the weight of a stretcher with uncomplaining strength. As they passed a severely wounded enemy soldier, a young man, no older than Dmitri's own Fyodor might one day be, crying out in a foreign tongue, one of the officers barked an order to leave him, to focus on their own. But Pyotr, without a word, without hesitation, bent down. He offered the dying Turk a sip of water from his own meager flask. His hand steady, his gaze compassionate. The act was swift, almost imperceptible, a fleeting gesture of mercy in a landscape of utter brutality. It was a sacrifice, not of life, but of principle, of obedience to an inhumane order. A quiet rebellion of the soul against the dictates of war. This was not the rigid discipline of the barracks, but a profound, almost instinctive affirmation of shared humanity, transcending the artificial boundaries of enemy and comrade. The observation settled in Dmitri's heart, a small, warm ember in the cold ashes of his despair. It was a reminder that even amidst the crushing weight of man's folly, even when all the grand narratives of God and Tsar seemed to dissolve into meaningless chaos, there remained within some men a deep, unshakable core of goodness, a capacity for compassion that defied all circumstance. This was the true miracle. Perhaps, not the absence of suffering, but the persistence of grace even within it. He found himself working alongside other peasants, men from different villages, different backgrounds, yet united by the shared experience of terror and the communal task of tending to the wounded. They spoke little, their communication often limited to grunts and gestures, but a profound understanding passed between them. They shared what little water they had, helped each other lift heavy bodies, offered a steadying hand to a man whose legs trembled from shock. There was no rank, no discipline beyond the immediate need to alleviate suffering. It was a camaraderie born not of military training, but of shared vulnerability, a silent pact of mutual support against the vast indifference of the battlefield. Dmitri saw Frol, who had been wounded in the leg, being carried on a makeshift stretcher. Despite his pain, Frol managed a weak smile, a fleeting glimmer of his old cheerfulness. When he saw Dmitri, still alive, "Dima," he whispered, his voice thin. For now, it was a simple exchange, yet it resonated deeply, a shared acknowledgement of survival, A moment of connection in the face of overwhelming odds. Dmitri realized that these men, his comrades, were not just cogs in a machine, they were individual souls. Each grappling with their own terrors. Each capable of unexpected kindness. Later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the smoke-filled sky in hues of melancholy gray and bruised purple, the sounds of the battlefield slowly quieted. The groans diminished, replaced by a profound, pervasive weariness. Dmitri sat in a shallow hollow, his body aching, his mind reeling. He still clutched the wooden cross his father had given him, its smooth surface now warm from his constant grip. He had tried to pray earlier, to call upon God, but the words had felt hollow, meaningless. Now, however, seeing these acts of quiet compassion, of shared humanity, a new kind of prayer began to form in his heart, not of words, but of profound, unspoken questions and a desperate yearning. If God was not in the thunder of cannons, not in the triumphant cries of victory, perhaps he was in these small, unexpected moments of human grace. Perhaps he was in Ivan's selfless burden, in Pyotr's quiet mercy towards an enemy, in the unspoken solidarity of men facing shared terror. Perhaps the divine presence was not to be found in grand, distant pronouncements, but in the fragile, persistent flicker of goodness within the human heart, even when surrounded by unimaginable evil. This realization, a slow, dawning light in his soul, did not erase the horror of the battle, nor did it fully restore his shattered faith to its former innocent certainty. The questions about God's purpose in such suffering remained profound and agonizing, but these moments of grace provided glimmers of hope, preventing his soul from succumbing entirely to the abyss of despair. They hinted at an enduring good, a resilient spark of humanity that refused to be extinguished even in the deepest darkness. He remembered Anna's words, "To question is not to lose faith. Dima, it is to seek a deeper understanding." And his father's, "Endure what must be endured." He had endured the terror of battle, but now, he was called to endure the spiritual desolation of its aftermath, to seek a new understanding of God's presence in a world irrevocably stained by man's folly. He was beginning to see that faith was not merely a passive acceptance of dogma, but an active, arduous search for meaning amidst chaos, a relentless pursuit of light in the heart of darkness. As night descended, bringing with it a chilling cold, Dmitri found a small, sheltered spot to rest. He lay down, his body aching, his mind still reeling, but with a new, subtle current of hope flowing beneath the surface of his despair. The images of death and destruction still tormented him, but now, they were overlaid with the fleeting, yet powerful, images of Ivan's compassion, of Pyotr's mercy, of the shared silence of suffering men. He closed his eyes, clutching the wooden cross, and for the first time since leaving Krasnoe, a different kind of peace, fragile but profound, settled over him. It was not the innocent peace of his village, but a hard-won, battle-scarred peace, born of witnessing both man's boundless depravity and his enduring capacity for good. He knew his journey was far from over, that the crucible would continue, but he had found, in the heart of the abyss, the first glimmer of a renewed, more complex, yet ultimately stronger, faith. His steadfast heart, though shattered, was beginning the slow, painful process of piecing itself back together, fortified by these unexpected moments of grace. Chapter 9. The Long March Home, a shadow of the former man. The war, that insatiable beast, had finally begun to draw its last, ragged breaths, not with a decisive, trumpeting victory or a clear, resounding defeat, but with a gradual, weary cessation, like a monstrous storm that slowly grumbles itself into silence. Rumors had trickled down the lines for weeks, of armistices signed in distant capitals, of weary diplomats arguing over maps, of armies, exhausted and broken, simply laying down their arms. And then, one cold, gray morning, the orders came, not to attack, not to defend, but to march home. For Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov, who had endured the brutal crucible of battlefields and the dehumanizing monotony of military life for what felt like an eternity, the news was a profound shock. It was not the joyous, unrestrained elation he might once have imagined. Instead, a complex wave of emotions washed over him, a vast, bone-deep weariness, a cautious disbelief, and a profound, aching sense of loss that mingled with the nascent hope of return. He was alive, yes, a survivor of the inferno. But the man who had left Krasnoe, the simple peasant with the innocent heart, was irrevocably gone. He was a shadow of his former self, carrying a burden far heavier than any soldier's pack. The long march home began, a slow, arduous procession across the vast, scarred landscape of Mother Russia. It was a journey of relentless introspection for Dmitri. Each weary step a new contemplation of the chasm between the world he was leaving and the world he hoped to return to. The roads, once merely dusty pathways for peasants and merchants, now stretched before him as endless rivers of mud and broken stone. A grim testament to the passage of armies. He walked amongst hundreds, then thousands of other soldiers, all survivors, all bearing their own invisible wounds. Their faces, once hardened by the brutal discipline of the barracks, were now etched with a profound weariness, a silent testimony to the horrors they had witnessed, to the comrades they had left behind. The sounds of war, the thunder of cannons and the crackle of muskets, had ceased, but the silence that replaced it was not the peaceful quiet of Krasnoe. It was a silence filled with ghosts. Dmitri's mind, no longer assaulted by the immediate demands of survival, was relentlessly haunted by memories. He saw the faces of the fallen, young Frol, his cheerful spirit extinguished on the field of blood, Grigory, the young husband, whose anguished cries for his wife still echoed in Dmitri's nightmares, brave Pyotr, whose stoic resilience had failed him on a freezing, desperate retreat. These were not mere memories, they were living presences, silent companions on his long march home. Their suffering a weight upon his soul. He was a silent witness to unimaginable suffering, and their torment had, in a profound and irrevocable way, become his own. His body, though physically intact save for a few minor scars, carried the indelible marks of the war. His frame, once robust and supple from a lifetime of labor, was now gaunt, his shoulders perpetually hunched, his movements carrying a new, almost mechanical stiffness. His peasant hands, once so attuned to the delicate rhythm of the earth, felt strangely alien to him, their dexterity replaced by an unthinking competence with rifle and bayonet. He was physically present, yet profoundly absent from himself, a vessel filled with too many grim experiences. The landscape they traversed, once vibrant with life, was now a desolate testament to man's folly. Fields lay fallow and scorched. Villages were razed to the ground, their chimneys standing like skeletal fingers against the sky. The sight of these ruined homes, these desolate fields, filled Dmitri with a profound, aching sorrow. He thought of Krasnoe, of his own Izba, of his flourishing fields. Would they, too, have suffered such a fate? He clutched the small, worn wooden cross his father had given him, its cool surface a small comfort against the chilling dread that sometimes seized him. His promise to Anna, to return, burned fiercely in his heart, a guiding beacon in the encompassing darkness of his memories. His spirit, which had been deeply questioned and almost shattered in the crucible of battle, remained adrift in a spiritual wilderness. The simple, unwavering faith of his youth seemed a relic of a distant, impossible past. How could God, a benevolent and loving God, allow such senseless destruction, such widespread, unutterable suffering? He had witnessed men commit acts of unspeakable brutality, and he had seen others endure with a profound, almost saintly stoicism. He had seen moments of grace, fleeting glimpses of human kindness amidst the abyss, but these were fragile sparks against an overwhelming darkness. The grand pronouncements of Father Sergei, of holy war and divine purpose, now felt hollow, meaningless, utterly detached from the visceral reality of what he had endured. He carried within him the burden of unanswered prayers, of faith shaken to its very foundations, wrestling with the profound silence of God in the face of human depravity. The long march was a time of forced introspection. There was little conversation amongst the returning soldiers. Each man seemed lost in his own private world of memory and trauma. They walked in a collective silence, their shared experiences too terrible to articulate, too profound to share with words. Sometimes, a man would suddenly cry out in the night, his dreams invaded by the horrors of battle. Sometimes, a man would simply stop marching, his will utterly broken, and would have to be dragged or abandoned. Dmitri observed these things with a profound, weary detachment. his own emotions too raw, too deeply buried to surface. He thought of Anna, of her soft hands, her quiet strength. He thought of Fyodor and Maria, their innocent laughter. He yearned for them with an aching intensity that made his physical weariness feel secondary. But he also feared. What if he had returned to change? What if the man who stepped onto the soil of Krasnoe was a stranger to the woman he had promised to return to? The brutal realities of battle, the casual brutality he had witnessed and, at times, participated in, had left an indelible mark on his soul. He had learned to kill, to obey without question, to suppress his own humanity in the face of overwhelming terror. Could he shed these hardened layers, peel back the soldier and rediscover the peasant, the husband, the father? The question tormented him. He remembered the words of his father, Ivan Petrovich, "You will return, change." His father, a veteran of a past conflict, had understood this truth with a chilling prescience. Dmitri carried the silent scars of his father's words, seeing them etched anew on his own soul. He was a survivor, yes, but survival had come at a cost. The innocence of his heart, nurtured in the gentle soil of Krasnoe, had been irrevocably lost on the fields of blood. He was now burdened with a knowledge that no man should bear. A silent witness to unimaginable suffering, to the profound folly of man's destructive impulse. As the weeks turned into months, and the march continued, the landscapes gradually shifted. The scarred fields of the war zone slowly gave way to less ravaged lands. Then to familiar Russian plains, to forests of birch and pine. The air grew cleaner, purer, carrying the distant scent of wood smoke, a nostalgic echo of home. But even these familiar sights and smells brought a bittersweet ache, a profound sense of temporal displacement. The world had moved on, but he felt forever trapped in the terrible memories of the war. He observed his fellow conscripts, those from Krasnoe and neighboring villages. Frol, despite his wound, seemed to regain a fraction of his old cheerfulness as they neared home. Though his eyes remained shadowed, Grigory remained withdrawn, his gaze vacant, his spirit seemingly broken beyond repair. Ilya, the widower, moved like a ghost, utterly silent, his face a mask of profound, unremitting despair. Pyotr, the stoic, carried himself with a grim, unyielding determination, his endurance a testament to sheer willpower. Each man bore his own burden, his own silent testimony to the war's profound, lasting impact. The nearer they drew to their home districts, the more acute became Dmitri's mixture of yearning and dread. He yearned for the warmth of Anna's embrace, the laughter of his children, the familiar comfort of his izba. But he dreaded the reunion, the unspoken questions in their eyes, the inevitable shock of confronting the man he had become. How could he explain the horror, the senselessness, the profound spiritual crisis that had consumed him? How could he reconcile the simple faith they cherished with the utter godlessness he had witnessed? He found himself praying again, not with the simple certainty of his youth, but with a new, raw honesty. He prayed for the strength to face his family, to hide the darkest corners of his soul, to somehow re-enter the world he had been torn from. He prayed for forgiveness for the things he had seen, the things he had been forced to do. He prayed for a path back to peace, not the naive peace of his past, but a deeper, harder one, serenity that could accommodate the indelible scars he now carried. His steadfastness, he realized, was not the unmoving rock he had once believed it to be, but a battered, resilient spirit, bending but not breaking, determined to find its way back to the light, even from the deepest abyss. As the first familiar landmarks of his gubernia appeared, a certain cluster of hills, a curve in the river, the distant spire of a church he recognized from market days, a tremor went through him. He was close. The burden he carried felt heavier than ever. But beneath it, a faint, flickering flame of hope began to stir. He was a shadow of the man who had left, physically and emotionally scarred, haunted by the faces of the fallen and the memories of unimaginable suffering. But he was home, and for Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov, the long, arduous march was finally coming to an end. A return to dust, yes, but perhaps, also, to a new beginning. Chapter 10. The familiar unfamiliar, a family reunited. Changed. The road, which for countless weeks had stretched before Dmitri Ivanovich Volkov as a relentless testament to distance and despair, finally yielded its immensity. The last few versts dissolved beneath his weary boots. each step filled with a mixture of desperate yearning and profound apprehension. He saw it then, through the early morning mist, the faint, familiar outline of Krasnoe, the modest wooden dome of St. Nicholas Church, its cross catching the first hesitant rays of dawn, rose above the clustered izbas, a beacon that pierced the very core of his being. His heart, which had been a leaden weight throughout the endless march, now beat with a frantic, suffocating rhythm. He was home. Yet, this homecoming was not the joyous, unburdened return he had once, in the naive innocence of his village life, imagined. The man who had walked away from Krasnoe almost 2 years ago was gone, utterly consumed by the furnace of war. In his place stood a figure hardened by relentless marching, by the brutal discipline of the barracks, and by the unspeakable horrors of the battlefield. His body, though intact, was gaunt and stiff, his movements carrying a new, almost mechanical precision. His face, once open and earnest, was now etched with lines of weariness and a perpetual solemnity, his eyes holding a distant, haunted quality that seemed to gaze beyond the visible world. He carried a heavy burden, the silent, indelible scars of memory, a witness to man's boundless folly. As he drew closer, the details of the village began to emerge from the mist, the familiar curve of the river, the scent of wood smoke, the distant lowing of cattle. He saw figures moving about, beginning their morning chores, unaware of his approach. A profound wave of tenderness, so sharp it was almost painful, washed over him. Anna, his father, Fyodor, Maria, the names resonated in his soul, the very essence of his unwavering promise, the reason for his endurance. He felt a desperate urge to run, to embrace them, to melt into the familiar warmth of their love, but a subtle hesitation, a chilling awareness of the chasm that now stretched between his experience and their untouched peace, held him back. He was a stranger in his own land, a man profoundly altered. He walked past the first few izbas, their occupants still within, unaware. Then, he saw her, Anna. She was by the well, drawing water, her back to him, her auburn hair, neatly braided, caught the soft morning light. Her movements were familiar, graceful, imbued with the quiet efficiency of a peasant woman. For a moment, he simply stood, transfixed, memorizing her presence, fearing that any sound might shatter the fragile reality of her being there. He saw the slight stoop in her shoulders, the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of her own endurance, her quiet burdens. He took a hesitant step forward, his boot scuffing the dusty earth. Anna stiffened, then slowly turned. Her eyes, the color of hazelnut, met his. For a long, agonizing moment, neither moved. A flicker of disbelief, then a dawning comprehension, spread across her face. Her hands, still clutching the water pail, began to tremble. A gasp, a sound of profound shock and immense joy, escaped her lips. Dima, she whispered, the name a raw, choked cry. The pail clattered to the ground, and she ran to him, her arms outstretched. He met her halfway, pulling her into a fierce, desperate embrace, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her familiar, comforting scent. Her body, so soft and warm against his hardened frame, trembled with an intensity that matched his own. Anna, he murmured, his voice thick with unshed tears, a sound he had not uttered for what felt like a lifetime. My dearest Anna, I am home, I have returned. He clung to her, as if to anchor himself to this tangible reality, to assure himself that this was not another cruel dream from which he would awaken to the cold, brutal reality of the barracks. She pulled back slightly, her hands framing his face, her eyes searching his, tracing the new lines, the subtle changes. You are here, she whispered, her voice filled with an almost unbearable relief. God has answered my prayers. My Dima. Tears streamed down her face, tears of profound joy, but also, he saw, tears of dawning recognition, of a subtle, unspoken understanding that the man standing before her was not entirely the same man who had left. Her gaze lingered on his eyes, seeing the distant, haunted look that could not be concealed. The chasm, though unspoken, was already present between them. His father, Ivan Petrovich, emerged from his izba then, drawn by Anna's cry. The old man stood for a moment, his ancient eyes fixed on Dmitri. Then slowly, a profound, weary sigh escaped his lips. There was no rush, no dramatic display, only a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement, a silent communion of two men who understood the language of duty and endurance. He approached, his gaze unwavering, and laid a heavy, calloused hand on Dmitri's shoulder. "You have returned, Dima," he rumbled, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. "You have kept your promise. God is merciful." It was a powerful benediction, a recognition of his son's survival, a testament to his steadfastness. Dmitri, unable to speak, simply nodded, clutching the worn wooden cross in his pocket, its coolness a familiar presence. The children, Fyodor and Maria, now older, taller, and with their own quiet solemnity, approached cautiously, their eyes wide. Fyodor, now a boy of 9, with his serious, contemplative gaze, hung back, observing his father with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Maria, a girl of 7, still retained a glimmer of her old playful spirit, but even she seemed to sense the immense gravity of the moment. Dmitri knelt before them, his heart swelling with a profound tenderness that threatened to overwhelm him. They were so much older, their faces more defined, their innocent eyes holding a new awareness. "Fyodor, Maria," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, his hands reaching for them. They hesitated for a moment, then, driven by an instinct beyond understanding, rushed into his embrace. He pulled them tightly, burying his face in their hair, inhaling their familiar, beloved scent. Their small bodies felt strangely new, yet utterly comforting against his own hardened frame. "Papa," Fyodor whispered, his voice hushed, as if speaking to a stranger. "You are back." Maria, less articulate, simply clung to him, her small hands clutching his tunic, burying her face in his shoulder, her quiet whimpers a mixture of joy and apprehension. Dmitri held them, tears finally streaming down his face. Silent, cleansing tears that released some of the unbearable weight he had carried for so long. This was the fulfillment of his promise, the tangible reward for his endurance. The initial joy of reunion, however, was subtly, inexorably tempered by the unspoken chasm that now stretched between his wartime experiences and their peaceful existence. Anna looked at him with an immense love, yet her eyes often held a probing, almost fearful question. She saw the new lines etched around his mouth, the haunted depth in his gaze, the stiffness in his movements. He was her Dmitri, yes, but he was also a man profoundly altered, bearing wounds that could not be seen, scars that lay deep within his soul. In the days that followed, as Dmitri began to reintegrate into the rhythm of village life, the subtle signs of his transformation became more apparent. He moved with an almost unnatural quietness, his peasant gait replaced by a soldier's economy of motion. His gaze, once fixed firmly on the immediate tasks of the land, would often drift to the distant horizon, lost in unseen memories. The sounds of Krasnoe, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed to jar his hypersensitive ears. The sudden bark of a dog, the sharp cry of a child, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, each sometimes eliciting an involuntary flinch. A sudden tightening of his shoulders. He tried to resume his duties in the fields, to embrace the familiar solace of the earth. He walked behind the plow, the familiar weight of the handles in his hands, but the rhythmic turning of the soil, once a meditative act, now felt hollow, its purpose somehow diminished by the memory of battlefields where the earth was only churned by explosions and soaked with blood. The smell of fresh earth mingled, in his mind, with the acrid stench of gunpowder, the cries of the wounded, the distant thunder of cannons. He worked with a grim determination, his body remembering the movements, but his mind remaining distant, consumed by the echoes of the war. Anna, with her profound sensitivity, noticed these subtle shifts. She saw how his sleep was troubled by unseen terrors, how he would sometimes cry out in the night, his body racked by nightmares that spoke of horrors she could not comprehend. She saw how he recoiled from loud noises, how his eyes, though filled with love for her and the children, sometimes held a distant, haunted gaze that seemed to look right through them. She tried to question him, gently, about his experiences, but he would only offer vague, non-committal answers. His face shuddered, his words few. The truth, he knew, was too terrible to share, too alien to a world that had remained untouched by the inferno. How could he describe the senseless brutality, the profound moral ambiguities, the utter dehumanization he had witnessed? To try would be to wound her own innocent heart. to drag her into the abyss he had just escaped. His relationship with Fyodor also felt altered. The boy, eager to connect with his returned father, would bring him small carvings, ask questions about soldiering, about the Tsar's army. Dmitri would answer, but his words felt stiff, inadequate. He longed to tell his son of the true nature of war, of its brutal reality. But he found himself unable to articulate the horrors, unwilling to taint the boy's innocence. He saw the admiration in Fyodor's eyes, the longing for a heroic narrative, and it filled him with a profound sadness, a bitter irony. He was no hero, he was merely a survivor, burdened by memories too heavy for a child's imagination. Ivan Petrovich, however, seemed to understand with an unspoken intuition. The old man, who had seen his own share of distant conflicts, did not press Dmitri with questions. He simply watched, his ancient eyes discerning, his presence a quiet, unwavering anchor. He would sit beside Dmitri in the evenings, carving in comfortable silence, their shared understanding passing not through words, but through the profound, unspoken language of shared experience. He knew the depths of the chasm that separated a returning soldier from the world he had left, for he had walked that path himself. Dmitri found moments of fleeting comfort in the familiar rhythms of Krasnoe, the communal prayers in the church, the gathering by the well, the shared meals with neighbors. Yet, even in these familiar settings, he felt a subtle estrangement, a sense of being both present and profoundly absent. He was a man who had seen too much, understood too much, to fully reintegrate into the simple, unquestioning harmony of village life. The echoes of the distant war, the cries of the wounded, the stench of gunpowder, the faces of the fallen, they resonated within him, a constant, private symphony of sorrow that no outer peace could entirely silence. His faith, which had been so profoundly shaken on the fields of blood, remained a turbulent current within him. He still knelt before the icon in his izba. He still attended church, but his prayers were now different, more complex, infused with questions and doubts. He sought God, not in the comforting certainties of old, but in the raw, aching reality of his new existence. He yearned for meaning, for purpose. In the face of the senseless suffering he had witnessed, he held fast to the small, wooden cross his father had given him, its worn surface a tangible link to a faith he was struggling to rebuild. Piece by painful piece, the chasm between his wartime experiences and their peaceful existence was unspoken. Yet it permeated every interaction, every moment of his life in Krasnoe. Anna loved him fiercely, but she saw the man altered, bearing wounds that could not be seen, scars on his soul that defied comprehension. His children sensed a profound change in their father, a quiet solemnity that was both comforting and subtly unsettling. And Dmitri himself, a shadow of his former self, moved through his familiar world as if through a dream, constantly navigating the invisible line between the man he was and the man he used to be. Haunted by the enduring echoes of a distant war, his steadfast heart, though returned to the gentle soil, was irrevocably marked by the crucible of fire, forever bound to the scars of memory. Part 2 of the story ends here. Thank you and goodbye. See you again in the next part.